Hey guys, welcome back! If you thought that all great 8-bit computer games of the 80s came from England, well, think again. This week we'll be traveling back to 1985, year when it all began, for one of the greatest Spanish video game developing companies, TOPO Soft. Let's take a look.
It all started in 1985 when the golden age of Spanish software development for 8-bit home computers was flourishing. ERBE Software was, in the 80s, the biggest and most important Spanish video game publisher that became famous not for Paco Pastor, its founder, being the ex-vocalist of Formula 5, but for their anti-piracy battle, attaining the rights to publish video games from renowned companies like Ocean, US Gold, Gremlin, etc., with much lower prices and sold all throughout the Iberian Peninsula. Back then, when I saw ERBE's logo stamped on the cover, I knew that I was buying quality controls and tested stuff for my ZX Spectrum, Amiga and later for my IBM PC. This caused a huge revolution. Full-priced video games of around 12 euros each started to be sold at about 5 euros under ERBE's label and distribution. Surprisingly for some, it triggered a gigantic boom in sales. From this moment on, piracy was practically a thing from the past. I remember to buy great original games for my PC at my favorite magazine store. Every month, along with Micro Hobby, the most famous Spanish ZX Spectrum magazine, I also used to buy a monthly ERBE publication dedicated to a specific game, bundled with its own physical copy. The first number brought Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the graphic adventure for IBM PCs. ERBE's marketing and merchandising system was extremely powerful and converted Spain and Portugal in late 80s into almost piracy-free countries. Besides spawning this low-price revolution, ERBE also made possible for the small Spanish developers to prosper and publish their games abroad. One of those developers was TOPO Soft, that was established at the basement of ERBE's building. In Spanish, topo means low, the lowest point or position, or even a mole. It all started when Emilio Martinez thought about creating an educational software for his nephew based on the Spanish geography. He asked his fellow programmer friend Javier Cano to do the graphics, and thus Map Game was born. Curiously, the title was developed in a black and white TV, not knowing what the game looked like when they finished it. One day, the two friends took the game at a ZX Spectrum reseller and asked permission to test the game on a color monitor. Emilio and Javier were amazed by the beauty of the graphics, and the owner of the shop was blown away. Quickly, he handed over to the young programmers an ERBE business card. So both created their own brand, Action, and, seeing a probable commercial profit, they made copies of the game and started selling it at the Rastro de Madrid, a kind of used and second-hand stuff local fair. Then, both agreed on contacting ERBE, and their future was at this point assured. The publishing rights for the game were sold to ERBE, and both programmers were hired to work on an Amstrad CPC version of Map Game and, later, for the MSX. The game was a sales success, and at this point they met José Manuel Muñoz, also known as Rambo, a very talented programmer specialized on working with sprites with masks, a hugely important aspect when working with moving objects on screen. José Muñoz had this script for an action and fighting type of game, and he was so thrilled about it that he managed to convince his two new friends to embark with him in his quest. So, ERBE Software hired José, and the trio designed in 1986 Las Tres Luces de Glaurung, that was extremely well received by Spanish gamers, which led to an English translated version for distribution in the UK by Melbourne House and under the name Conquistador. Feeling the need of separating the distribution business from the development of new products, ERBE created at this point TOPO Soft. Still under ERBE's label were developed two more games. Ramon Rodriguez in 1986, that wasn't as successful but highly entertaining, fun and extremely difficult. And Whopper Chase in 1987, a promotional title that was ordered by Burger King to be offered to customers, in which the tape contained all four 8-bit versions of the game: Spectrum, Amstrad, MSX and Commodore. TOPO Soft's premiere was with the game Spirits in 1987, which led till 1991 to a gigantic wave of awesome games that catapulted TOPO Soft to the very top of Spanish video game development, rivaling with the giant and well-established Dynamic. Let's now take a quick look at the essential games from TOPO Soft. An awesome arcade action game where you control an extraterrestrial character somewhat based off the record in the movie Alien. An amazing shoot 'em up that didn't grab the attention it deserved. Based in the Capcom arcade hit Gunsmoke and kind of a Red Dead Redemption of that era. A huge hit in Spain and in the UK. Action game with two players simultaneously! Wow, awesome stuff! Was considered one of the best games from TOPO Soft. Curiously, the C64 version was totally different from all the others. As you can see, the scrolling is made in the horizontal. A new vision and, again, off-the-record version of the classic Pac-Man. For the English release they even had to remove the first level, cause it was so identical to the original Pac-Man that TOPO could run into trouble. A pirates game where we need to infiltrate a ship and grab a treasure map hidden inside a fiercely guarded safe. Something related to the Untouchables or the Godfather movies is purely coincidence, an extremely difficult but very well made title. One of the best Spanish action-adventure games ever made. Probably the best game TOPO Soft made for IBM PCs. Another movie-inspired game, this time around it's Ben-Hur, complete with chariot races, was released in the UK under the Kicks label, the budget range of the mighty US Gold. TOPO's pinball game, and I love pinball games, but this one didn't have what it needed to be a good pinball game. What a shame. The game's beautifully detailed graphics can somewhat attenuate its extreme difficulty, trying to control the carriage and at the same time blow the enemies away. One hell of a game that I've played so many freaking times back then. Simple concept and highly addictive, it practically passed unnoticed. A funny thing about the cover of Rock'n'Roller is that in the Spectrum and MSX versions it was inverted. The letters on the stop sign are inverted. Someone was really wasted or in a bad mood. This title sold more than 100,000 copies. It became the best-selling Spanish video game of all time. But by then, and as for soccer games, Matchday 2 was still the best. It was the very first time I've ever saw something like this, a cycling simulator. What an achievement for 1989, and all fans of La Vuelta were amazed by it. One of the best Spanish video games of all time, and as a huge fan of adventure and exploration, I couldn't simply stop playing it. Sadly, the Commodore 64 owners never had a chance to try it. Its development was cancelled. The Spanish localization of Gremlin's Gary Lineker games, Super Skills and Hot Shot, to compete with Dynamic's Michel Football Master that was hugely popular in Spain by that time. Sadly, it was a failed attempt. A really poor basketball game. Don't bother trying. The sequel to Mad Mix game, and if the first one was based on Pac-Man, this one is on Pac-Mania. Curiously, they've published the game with a black and white cover for fans to develop their own painting skills. Later was announced the winner, and the cover would be used in a special edition of the game, that I believe never happened. Another awesome adventure game that had its best version on IBM PCs, with some amazing and colorful EGA graphics. This title was based on a comic book character by Alfonso Azpiri, a Spanish artist that also made the cover for the game, and as well many others for practically every Spanish software house. And when the game had a cover by Azpiri, I would certainly buy it. You couldn't miss. Games with covers made by this great artist were always good games. Take Viaje al Centro de la Tierra as an example. About the game, it's a pretty good arcade action title with some differences between the 8 and 16-bit versions, so you need to try them all. This one was just to keep the releases coming. Nothing special, just a shoot all things on screen type of game. A kind of hard to control game, but when you get the hang of it, it's quite fun. Another kill all enemies and stay alive game. The first and, I believe, only official movie adaptation which had such a huge media coverage never seen from a Spanish game. The hype was so enormous that they had to ask the UK-based Elite Systems to make the 16-bit versions. The game was okay, despite the amount of time they spent making it. Many players ended up losing interest and just bought another games. One of my favorite Spectrum games ever, and obviously inspired by Disney's movie Tron. Super fast, super addictive and with awesome music. I was wrong when I said that all games with covers by Azpiri were good. Well, Desperado 2 is a decent game, but was released in a time that LucasArts was around with their amazing point-and-click adventure games, and Wolfenstein 3D was as well around the corner. This was the point where it all started to collapse for the Spanish video game industry. The follow-up to Perico Delgado and One Last Breath for TOPO Soft. It's a brilliant professional cycling simulator that, again, attained high scores on specialized magazines and was, I think, the first TOPO Soft game with support for VGA graphics on the PC. TOPO Soft made one last effort to conquer the IBM PC's market with 6 more games. Black Crown, Luigi and Spaghetti, Olimpíadas 92 Gimnástica Deportiva and Olimpíadas 92 Atletismo, Luigi in Circus Land, and finally Super SCIRREAL. The Spanish video game crisis arrived around 1989, year when companies had to canalize and adapt their efforts towards the 16-bit machines that were already flourishing. The 8-bit era was practically over and TOPO Soft tried really hard to make it work. Viaje al Centro de la Tierra was probably the biggest bet in the area ever made in Spanish territory. It was one of the few games that had all three most important 16-bit home computer versions, Amiga, Atari ST and DOS, and also distributed in the US without any tangible success. Every time I saw a TOPO Soft game on one of my favorite video game resellers, I was always impressed by their extremely well drawn covers. Back then I was a huge superhero comic book fan and collector, and as well created my own universe along with a couple of friends. We even developed our own brand and presented our work at a couple of magazine publishers here in Portugal. Needless to say that they've revealed some interest, but that was all. So we started making and selling our own fanzine on a few specialized shops. The box art and loading screens from TOPO's games were a sight to behold. Definitely one of the best in my opinion and taste, obviously. So guys, have you played any of these amazing titles? Obviously, there were other great Spanish video game developers around, like for instance Dynamic, ERBE Soft and Ziggurat made in Spain. But TOPO Soft, being part of the ERBE group, needed a special treatment. It was part of one of the greatest and most successful anti-piracy campaigns ever. Feel free to comment, like, dislike, subscribe, unsubscribe, whatever. You're the boss. And if you've enjoyed this short look back at the Spanish golden age of video gaming, stay tuned! More awesome stuff is coming. And while you continue hearing my voice, why don't you just click on one of those videos? And there's probably more in my channel that could be of some interest. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next week.